Education Awards. And then David Baume, who has very kindly stepped in, as I say, has since 2001 been an independent international higher education researcher, evaluator, consultant, staff and education developer, and writer. He's been a CODE visiting fellow since 2010 and was founding chair of the UK Staff and Education Development Association, CEDA, co-founder of the UK Heads of Education Development, founding council and a founding council member of the International Consortium for Education Development, and founded the International Journal for Academic Development. His contribution to academic development have been acknowledged by awards from CEDA and ICED. So this panel session is going to focus on, more than ever, how higher education institutions are exploring the value and benefits of online and distance education, which is what we've been looking at all week, and also examining research-informed lessons learned from the shift to online and hybrid teaching and learning. What we hope is that the panel will look at different angles of the distance education student experience, looking at a research-informed approach, crossing the ODE landscape from a generic view on what research says about what works well in ODE to examining specific successes in areas such as learning design, assessment, and learning in hybrid and high-flex environments. So this session is going to explore some of what we know about the emerging and rapidly growing research-informed base around online and distance education. And we are going to look together at this. Christine Turani Makiva from the Royal Veterinary College and I will be chairing this session, and we're going to move forward together now. I'm going to invite Norbert, first of all, Norbert Pachler, to talk to the topic. Thank you, Norbert.
Thank you very much, Mary, for this introduction. I think you're inviting me and colleagues for attending in such numbers. What I've tried to do in preparation for today's session is have a look at the literature to try and approach the topic of BAS when we look at online learning work from the perspective of research and in particular empirical research in the field. I think it's important to acknowledge as we look at the field of education and technology research, that of course the research base is characterized by a number of limitations, and I think it's important that we acknowledge those, and there's various important pieces of literature setting out those limitations, but they tend to revolve around a certain lack of theorization. They tend to focus on the often small-scale, short-term, piecemeal nature of the research, the fact that certain methodological paradigms tend to prevail, and that often there is an over-reliance on self-reported perceptual data. So what that, of course, means is that it is not very easy to try and derive calls to action necessarily from the research. But valiant efforts have been made in recent years, particularly through a wide range of meta-analysis, and I've taken time and trouble to look through a range of those in recent years, about 12 or 15 significant meta-analysis of the available research have been put together, and that conclusion is that on average students in online learning conditions perform modestly better than those receiving face-to-face instruction. So that in and of itself, at a sort of meta level, is a fairly encouraging set of findings and insights for us. And what these sort of meta-analysis furthermore help us understand is that if you have a blended approach, then the benefits are comparatively significant. So if there are elements of face-to-face within a blended approach, then the positive effects are more significant. That, I think, should give us a lot of hope. What I would like to do in the next few minutes, though, is focusing on one particular meta-analysis, because unlike all the others, it actually seeks to identify a number of variables, and that is what the study is trying to test out, that significantly affect online learning outcomes. I'll try and go through some of these variables, what's known about them already, with a view to maybe helping us as code fellows and as researchers and practitioners in the field to conceptualize our own interventions that might help us understand some of these dimensions better. The first variable that this study by you in 2022, and I think I've got the reference on the screen, identifies is what it calls behavioral intention. And it argues that behavioral intention can be enhanced with the entertainment and gamification elements of technology, but that at the moment relatively little is known about the interrelationship between learners' engagement, enhanced behavioral intention, and improved learning outcomes. So it's all about trying to focus the motivational orientation of learners on certain types of behavior, which can be seen to be positively influencing learning outcomes. As a second variable that this particular study tests out is around instruction, and in particular interest is instructor immediacy as a bridge between a gap between instructors and students. And again, it comes to the conclusion that whilst this phenomenon of instructor immediacy is relatively little explored in the literature, there is an argument that things like instructive pace, flexibility, and accessibility can be important factors influencing online learning effectiveness. And another sort of sub-dimension of instruction is the effect of instructors' professional development as a variable of the efficacy of instructional online support. And again, is argued that there's still relatively little knowledge about this, but that might be a very productive potential area of further investigation. The third of those 9 variables is engagement. The study argues that engagement is needed for effective learning, that levels of cognitive load may impact on learning engagement. So the invitation there for us as learning designers is to think about the demands that our learning design makes in terms of cognitive learning. Learning engagement, the study argues, is facilitated by peer interactions, forum discussions, and student-teacher communications. And self-efficacy, it is argued, rather than learning persistence, can greatly influence online learning engagement. So the self-perception of the learner's capacity of achieving online success, i.e. self-efficacy, rather than learning persistence, seems to be the important dimension here. So what can we do to try and promote self-efficacy through the way in which we design our online interactions and programs? And then it furthermore notes that self-regulation can be positively correlated with online engagement. And again, those of you in the field will no doubt have noticed that in the last 2 years, a large number of studies on self-regulation started to appear. Indeed, I've recently taken on a PhD student who's looking at exactly that. And what the study does, in case I haven't explained that properly, it builds those sorts of hypotheses on the basis of a survey of the existing literature and then tests it out statistically. The next variable is interaction, which, according to the study, plays an indispensable role in online learning outcomes. So, to what extent are we fostering and facilitating interaction? And it is argued that immersion could facilitate interactions, and the relational coordination of mutual processes is considered to be a quality marker. So, interaction as another important variable. Then three more. One is motivation and self-efficacy, which again I think to be essential influences of positive online learning outcomes. It's argued that highly motivated learners, and by that the study means those that are able to set goals and strive for them, may be able to possess positive self-efficacy, maintain interpersonal relationships, and obtain plentiful learning resources, as well as a high level of cognitive engagement. So, motivation clearly an important key here. And it is also argued that synchronous approaches with timely feedback of strong motivators could provide more benefits than asynchronous ones. And finally, the two last ones, performance, may intertwine with factors such as social factors, social presence, interaction and feedback, and levels of motivation and feedback may greatly influence the correlations between learning engagement and learning performance. Finally, satisfaction and self-regulation as critical in online learning success. And one particular interesting dimension here is the extent to which instructors' self-disclosure, i.e. Things like instructors introducing themselves, sharing about themselves as people in person, may positively influence student satisfaction with the learning instructor relationship. And there's a close relationship between self-regulation, i.e. learning guided by things like practical vision, strategic actions such as planning, monitoring, evaluating personal progress, standards, and motivation to learn, as well as learning outcomes. So what I'm trying to say by reporting these findings, I don't think it is a binary yes, no, online blended learning works or doesn't work. What we actually need to do is we need to dig deeper, and we need to look at the range of different variables that the research has helped us identify, and then build appropriate learning designs that takes into account the potential that existing research suggests some of those variables might have in terms of online learning outcomes, positive online learning outcomes. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you very much, Norbert. So Norbert has given us some ideas about the variables involved. I'm going to pass now to Steve Warburton and ask Steve again to address the topic or the thought, does online and distance education work? Steve, over to you.
Look, it's really exciting to be here. It's been a long time since I've been in that particular room, even though I'm only beaming in virtually. And certainly in the spirit of international flavour, I'm coming in from Australia. It's quite exciting to be part of a hybrid event. Look, just before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm presenting from. So I'm in Armidale, New South Wales, Australia, and this is Anawan country. And I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I'm just a bit of background. I'm now working at the University of New England. I did work for the University of London at one time, which was fantastic. There are some similarities as well. UNE is Australia's oldest online and distance education institution. We have around 23,000 students. 83% of those students are online, mostly studying part-time. And I will come back to that a little bit in these few slides that I've got. And I've only got 7 slides, and I'm just going to raise a few of my thoughts around the question, which is a very interesting one, around the effectiveness of online does online education work? The approach that I'm going to take, or the view I'm going to take, is to look from a retention data perspective and raise that perennial challenge that we have for online and distance education institutions around retention and attrition figures. And I've just plucked out, I could have taken one of many different studies. This is actually in honor of Ormond Simpson, who was a CDE fellow, from one of his papers. I liked it because it was Ormond's, who's got a strong background in distance education, but also I like the title, Student Retention in Distance Education, Are We Failing Our Students? So my question would be for us as a panel, I think, and also for the audience, is do we think retention data is a good measure of the effectiveness of the educational offer that we make as an online and distance education institution? And maybe we should ask who actually cares. Why? Who cares? Well, certainly regulatory bodies care. TEXA does. TEXA is the quality assurance agency in Australia. Low retention is a red flag for our quality assurance agency, TEXA, and they will certainly come in and they inquire why you have low retention figures. The government cares. Recent Australian legislation around JRG, that's job ready graduates, set up a hurdle for students whereby if they fail 50% of their courses in 1 year, they become ineligible for funding. So the government cares. Certainly then, I think what we're discussing here is some of those negative perceptions around the efficacy of online distance education, despite Norbert's review of the efficacy and the positive nature of online education. The perception is different. There is the loss of student pipeline and the financial drag that causes on the institution. Of course, students care as well, and students care because they see their other students disappear from their ranks. So again, what does this say about online distance education? Is it an inferior product? I'm going to make two contentions. Oh, I've got a slight aside as well, I just realised. And I'll just make this point here. I really don't think MOOCs has helped the perceptions of quality and efficacy in online education with these kinds of graphs around MOOCs, where we've seen a lot of dropout and a lot of dissipation in terms of the activity within MOOCs. So just a little aside as well, and I think that adds to the sort of obfuscates the picture of what we're talking about when we look at online and distance education. So I'm going to make two contentions. The first of those, I'm going to do these quite quickly. The first of those is I think we need to go back and ask who our students are and genuinely look at what our cohorts are and what our markets look like. Online distance education students in our kinds of institutions, and when I say our, I'm talking about UNN, I'm really thinking about the University of London as well, they are highly heterogeneous. So this is a typical persona from a UNE student. It might look familiar to those working in online distance education. Life goals are different to our school leaders to some extent. Our career changes, they're often looking for career stability. Our demographic is interesting. The median age is 35. We are 70% female as well. And a high proportion of equity students. So that's the non-English speaking backgrounds, the women in non-traditional areas, no SES, rural region, remote, those with disability, now Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I think you really know to go back and look at what you think your student base is, and therefore what is your mission and purpose in relation to that demographic to which you serve. The second sort of contention I want to make is really, and I think Norbert made this as well, I think, yeah, fairly obviously we probably want to nuance the question a little bit, and we can nuance it in different ways. So I'm coming from a sort of retention perspective here, but I really think we need to look at things around the sociocultural elements, the technical and the pedagogical elements here. So the only way to solve or deal with some of those challenges around retention, some of those perceptions about retention rates and what they say about the quality, is build a model, look at a framework. So this is a nice framework. This is fairly famous. This is from McCarhu, Picton and Nelson. It's been adapted a few times. A number of institutions have taken this framework and used this as a model for action. So particularly when you look at this, the important bit, it shows the distal and proximal elements that come into the educational setting or the learning environment, but it really picks out 4 key elements. We've already mentioned one of them, self-efficacy, but really about emotions, that sense of belonging and well-being and mental health. And there's certainly a lot in the press at the moment that has really, I think COVID has stress tested quite a lot of these elements, emotions, belonging, well-being in particular. So using a framework and looking at the way that you actually address the problem is also incredibly critical in this space. So really what I'm saying is just a bit of a takeaway here is often we're in a position where we are kind of comparing apples and oranges, if I can put it that way. Yeah, they're both fruit, we're all doing education, but that comparison where I think we're comparing often a face-to-face setting with an online and distance education one really misses the point. It really misses, going back to that earlier slide, the mission of what we're doing, what the values are and what our market is, and the ways that we might be thinking about the way that we deliver that education as well. So for me, for UNE particularly, we're opening access, and for many, to those who would not normally have that opportunity to go into the higher education setting. I think, yes, we can produce a competent, I call it effective, transformative teaching environment, but from the socio-cultural, that techno-pedagogical perspective that I've kind of outlined there in the Kahu slide, then I think, well, technical, yes, we know that. We're doing a great job here. We're doing hybrid. We understand the technicalities. Pedagogy, we're very rich. That probably socio-cultural piece there, I would suggest, I would contend there is still work to be done. What does that work look like? Well, I think for me, many of those challenges around success in online distance education can be framed around actions that focus on engagement and supporting that student persistence. Again, I've mentioned before, self-efficacy, well-being, the emotional elements and belonging. We do an injustice to our online distance education, I'd contend, in terms of that apples and oranges approach. And certainly the way that I see many institutions in the sector moving forward is really around that intervention, and I'd call it relationship-rich approaches that both harness new technologies, so learning analytics is very big at the moment, and they couple those with powerful approaches. So I think really what we already do around transition pedagogy, Sally Kiff's work, and around scaffolding students into our higher education sector through those enabling pathways. And just to finish, last slide, I may have been a little bit harsh on MOOCs in my earlier slide. It is interesting to reflect on how we might be agile in our approaches to working with our offer. And I do think MOOCs, if anything, do offer a very rapid and certainly low risk testing ground for testing delivery formats and different structures that we can bring back into our larger offerings. I will say thank you very much, everyone, for being patient with my slides. I did have a backup plan, which is interpretive dance, just in case this didn't work, but it seems to have gone well. I will hand back over to the panel. Thank you, Mary, and thank you, panelists.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for joining us. I wouldn't even dream of guessing what time of day it is with you, but thank you for joining us, and thank you for making us think about whether ODE is an inferior product. Is it an apple or is it a pear? And the issues of who cares, and obviously students have to be prime in our thinking. Can I then pass on now, please, to Stylianos and ask you, Stylianos, to tackle the question, does open and distance learning work?
Okay, thank you very much, Mary. I'm just moving this microphone slightly. What I decided to do in the next 7 minutes is concentrate on a specific question. My context is distance learning, and I'm asking the question whether does online assessment work for distance learners. Need to clarify that I'm not separating assessment from learning and teaching. However, is a very important motivational factor, external motivation. Sometimes I'm talking about for distance learners. So it's very important to dedicate some time to that. There is an interesting situation in the last 2 horrible years we've gone through. It was terrible both for our students and for staff, particularly for the distance learners, even further isolation potentially. So the things I think there was a particularly positive aspect there, and people say there is a silver lining to quite a lot of awful situations. So the silver lining in this particular situation was that, and it's been discussed before, I don't think work has been published in a peer review context about that, the catalytic effect, the positive effect that the pandemic had on online assessment in the distance learning context. What I mean by that is that I believe there was a pedagogical breakthrough in open distance education assessment during the pandemic. By that, I mean and there is evidence out there. The evidence that is coming up comes from reports from important bodies in the UK and elsewhere, universities, UK, just the Office for Students, and also there is some published work, a peer-reviewed work coming up, quite a lot of meta-analysis, the meta-analysis that Norbert mentioned in his input. And what happened during in these debates during the pandemic, what was characteristic was the move to online assessment, the large scale. This affected as well. I need to talk about the University of London, because the University of London will be running this longitudinal evaluation of the move to online assessment, and we're doing it this year as well. It has some very important results that I think they're echoed by some other results in the sector. They are not isolated. So these debates during the pandemic in higher education providers, particularly the ones that were running distance learning courses, had to do with developing and transforming the educational strategies in relation to assessment to deal with the move to the online learning. Also, they had to do with quality assurance, making sure that they accommodate, they address some of the challenges. And the challenges were multiple. So this challenges was, part of the challenge was to develop alternative modes of assessment, moving some formats of assessment, exams comes to mind as a very good example, online, and transforming these formats of assessment is something different, is something that was more pedagogically friendly and pedagogically robust, for instance, adopting open world and open exams. And so there was quite a lot of work, quite a lot of debates reflected in the academic literature, for instance, from QAA 2021, from the Office for Students. One first thing I need to say is that a major determinant, a very revealing there, was the appetite of students for online assessment. And this comes across very well from the longitudinal evaluation that will be running at the University of London in the Center of Distance of Online and Distance Education, where 68% of the students would like to see online assessment staying in the future. This is reflected by other evidence outside the University of London. For instance, the gravity report of the Office for Students indicated that 61% of the students like online assessment. They would like online assessment to stay in the future. So what makes online assessment so attractive, to put it this way, for the distance learning sector, is flexibility, very important, and cost. Cost has to do with traveling quite often in the distance learning context, and also not most important is the ability of the students to demonstrate that they achieve learning outcomes in this kind of context. And this comes across in reports that are coming that are empirically based. The thing I wanted to mention in relation to the types of assessment in the distance learning context. So there is formative assessment that is taking place in distance learning environments. However, I feel, and I think the related literature echoes my voice, that formative assessment quite often is still an afterthought after years of research evidence of its value. So there is significant voice out there about the importance of formative assessment. Quite often, formative assessment is linked to, in the distance learning context, is linked to self-evaluation. And there is research out there, for instance, by Sadler and Good, that would discuss a significant improvement of the student results engaged in self-assessment. Steve mentioned MOOCs and peer assessment. I think there is important debate out there because peer assessment has been reinvented in the MOOCs. And there is some good literature out there that describes this, the MOOC paradigm, how online assessment is worked. Going back to assessment formats, there is a rehabilitation, multiple choice questions, and other automated assessment, because there's better technology to support them. And also there is some research on the use of artificial intelligence and its ability to support them better, in addition to developing big databases of randomized questions that people can pick up from. Also, there is a question of open book and open world exams and the authenticity, which has been discussed in this conference. It was another panel, and people come back to the authenticity and flexibility of assessment, which is very important. And I will give you an example in a distance learning context. I've been teaching a course which is on project supervision. So the students had the opportunity to engage in a project which is either evaluation or development or research. And they do that because they pick the context, the project that is very related, very linked to the context. So they have the opportunity to pick one of these three. Open books and flexible assessment are the subject of very important debate out there. For instance, Bates and others in 2021 have discussed the opportunity to have flexible assessments, the flexibility in assessment, and the authenticity related to employment, meaning by that the students are assessed in skills and competencies and knowledge which would be useful to the professional life and not engage in assessment which regurgitates facts and knowledge. There is an interesting factor there which I need to mention by finishing: academic integrity. And academic integrity has undermined quite a lot of the achievements we've seen in the last 2 years. So has destabilized some of the achievements in relation to online assessment. And universities and higher education providers have been doing quite a lot of work in this area by looking at the two aspects of how to address academic integrity. One which is more mechanistical, that has to do with developing or engaging or embedding proctoring systems in the educational practice, but a better one, which we've seen in the research we are engaged with at the University of London, redesigning assessment and making sure that assessments are up to address the students, the needs of distance learners in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stylianos. So there we have the reflections on assessment, online assessment, and what Stylianos called the catalytic effect of online assessment. So now finally, can I move to David Baume and invite you, David, to speak about whether online and distance education works.
Mary and colleagues, thank you. And Alan, please get well soon. Do online and distance education work? The Centre's defining a project on this at the moment, and we really need your help. First of all, we have to note that there are two questions here, one about online and one about distance education. Frankly, I don't envy us trying to disentangle these two ideas, let alone disentangling the ideas of part-time and full-time higher education. Anyway, what might we mean by work? We might feel the simple account of students succeeding at assessment. We should be able to get access to aggregated data on this. We might also think that we want our students to find online and distance education rewarding, accessible, congenial, convenient, and having many other virtues. We should be able to access any student evaluation and feedback results, but if we need more, we may be able to undertake surveys. Look, it's tempting to ask, how well do online and distance education work in comparison to what used to be conventional face-to-face education? I've got at least 4 difficulties in this. First of all, because of the varied pattern of higher education, with both differing and changing balances between in-person and online education, let alone distance education, it's very difficult to find an appropriate comparator for online and distance education. Another comparison problem, many students do not face an even choice as between in-person, online or distance education. Their circumstances, including but not limited to financial, geographical and social, may push or pull them towards one or another particular form of education and may exclude other forms. A comparison with something which is inaccessible is not a sensible comparison to make. Also, the comparison normalizes in-person, face-to-face education. And finally, for me, the comparison assumes that in-person, face-to-face education is some kind of a gold standard, that it works. That's a contestable proposition, shall we say. Stressing Steve's point just now, ODE does work in the specific sense of allowing students who couldn't otherwise study for a degree to do so. Really, really important point. We have to hang on to that. ODE does work in that sense. For the UK Office for Students, works, this is discussed in section B3 of the current draft regulatory framework, means works with respect to student continuation and completion, degree outcomes, including, happily, differential outcomes for students with different characteristics, and graduate employment and progression to professional jobs. And of course, OFS has suggested a number for each of these. We will need to work with this account. I wonder, do we have any data on the differential student characteristics as between ODE and face-to-face study? Again, acknowledging that many students study at recognised teaching centres. That complicates things still further. There are other points of reference against which we can judge whether or not and to what extent higher education of whatever form works. The Quality Assurance Agency's quality framework is very ambitious. For example, as part of their description for a degree with honours, this is section 4.15.1, holders of a bachelor's degree with honours will have developed an understanding of a complex body of knowledge, some of it at the current boundaries of the academic discipline. That's great. Through this, the holder will have developed analytical techniques and problem-solving skills that can be applied in many types of employment. The holder of such a qualification will be able to evaluate evidence, arguments, and assumptions to reach sound judgments and to communicate them effectively. I'm confident that our current final degree assessments test all of these abilities. That was intended to be a significant pause, obviously. And from one particular subject benchmark, geography, geographical education develops a range of subject-specific skills, including spatial awareness and observation, recognising the moral, ethical and safety issues involved in all aspects of geographical inquiry. It's a long list. If we imagine these capabilities being applied at the kind of academic level suggested a few moments ago by QAA, we have an understandable and defensible account of what it would mean for a degree in geography to be working. Look, problems remain around academic level. There are ways forward. Careful use of Bloom's taxonomy, staying at the upper levels of analysis, evaluation and synthesis can help us. So can John Biggs' alas underused solo taxonomy, which encourages us to concentrate on more complex tasks and interactions. The problems of assessment remain, even with apparently high-level assessment tasks, unless we know how many and how similar prior tasks the students have undertaken and received feedback on. You can't tell what an assessment task is just by looking at the task itself. You have to know something about how the student was prepared. But we won't go into all of this now because frustratingly such data are not accessible to us. Assessment results remain the nearest proxy measures we have and are likely to have, unless we can dive deep into examination papers, student answers, marking schemes, marked student scripts, unmoderated and then moderated marks. the beating heart of assessment, of judgment, of living academic level, of whether higher education actually, in terms described by the QAA, works. So we'll probably have to make do with student results, student feedback, and perhaps with surveys, unless you have better ideas. Please give us your better ideas, we need them. Of course, does it work is actually rather a boring binary question. How well does it work is a slightly less boring, it's still uniscalar question. We really want to know how, in what ways online and distance education do and do not work, and for whom, and also why. Those will be data that we can use if we can only get them. We made a little progress on finding out whether educational works in a thorough evaluation of the course that the centre ran in late 2021, early 2022 for 250 students at the Open University of China. They told us how satisfied they were with the course, average 97%. They told us how the course could be improved, which is very useful. They told us what they learned from the course. They told us how they planned to use what they learned from the course. 87% had definite plans to use what they'd learned. Later, they told us how they were using it, what they'd learned from the course. 89% had already made some use. This was an easier evaluation to carry out. The course of only a few months duration, highly vocational. We had direct access to the students. We'll probably not be able to get this close on the current study. Some work with Stephen Brown and I offered another angle on how does open distance education work. There seems to be a mismatch between staff and student views on what are useful elements. We'd love to know how ODE works for individual students, but until we ask them, we'll never go. So we'll have to go with the big measures. But in terms of our study, what would you like to know about how well ODE works? How else can we find out? What more would you like to know about this? Talk to us. There's a piece of paper on your tables with a link to a longer version of this talk, and also some Padlets which will collect information. We need your help on this. It's a vital question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. And there we have the setting out of the project that will look further at what or how does ODE work. What do we want to know about how it works? I think there we're challenged. So we've heard here a kaleidoscope of analyses and thoughts about whether ODE works. And now it's time for questions. And I'm going to ask Christine to take us forward with questions from the audience first of all. So if there are any, we have some from afar, but are there any questions that anyone wants to ask from the audience?
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to the panel for what's actually been a very broad, useful perspectives, different perspectives on what appears to be a simplistic question, but in actual fact is quite a complex one, and I guess fundamental to what we all do. So, as Mary has invited, questions, please. You were the first.
Okay, so my question is, if we'd asked this question before COVID, would it have been easier to answer?
Who wants to go first?
Well, I can have an initial start. I think in the same way Steve was talking about MOOCs not being particularly helpful, it might be argued that the need to move to a emergency remote response to COVID hasn't particularly helped our understanding of the affordances of online and distance education. Because in the time available, with the resources available, despite all the very goodwill and hard work that colleagues put in, clearly programs hasn't been possible to use the sort of full learning design expertise that exists for many of those programs. So in that sense, I think as we've seen yesterday when we discussed the government's perspective on the value of online, a sort of a set of misconceptions has developed that are proving not to be particularly helpful for the course.
Following, in addition to what Norbert was saying, I think, Linda, probably what the pandemic helped us in answering this question with is we know some of the opportunities, some of the limitations much better than we did 2 years or 3 years ago. I will mention a disciplinary example. For years, and there's been quite a lot of significant work. The Open University of the UK has done quite a lot of work in this area. People have been experimenting with online labs in disciplines that are where to do online labs is quite difficult, and people rely on physical presence. There's been quite a lot of failure during the pandemic in disciplines like that, but there've been quite a lot of very good examples. And yesterday in a session I was chairing, somebody was talking about healthcare, how these labs, computing code, right, in labs that are going to remain, and are going to be the established status of labs in computing as a big success. So I think, yes, the pandemic has allowed us to make some good judgment of approaches, pedagogical approaches that we didn't know much about before.
Thanks for that, Stylianos and Norbert. Steve, did you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that COVID point's really interesting from you, Norbert, as well, that you made there. Look, I think what it's made us do is just understand the value of what it means to be together in the same space physically, what it means to be apart in an online space, and understand that value. That is, I think, borne out in the fact that I see a reluctance to move back to a fully kind of face-to-face, although I know we were blended, a fully face-to-face setting, both in professional life, but also in that educational sphere as well, and a switch in that. And I certainly see, just in my work environment, both across the education space, but just across the sort of management professional space, a desire to use both the virtual and real in different kinds of ways, because they do have different values with them. So particularly when we do academic board, it's the most undemocratic session that we ever do. It's really nice to do it in a virtual setting because it democratizes the ability for people to actually speak. So we've found there's a much better setting than sitting around a table with the hierarchy at one end and our sort of student voice at the other. There are other areas where it actually is not so great, and that is where you're trying to do a very closed session and get things done with a small stakeholder group around design thinking. No, you do actually want to be in a physical space, and it is nice to have a whiteboard and post-it. So it's really kind of crystallized what we do together in social spaces. So I think that's one of the big values. Thank you, Christina.
Thanks, Steve. And actually, your response to that question leads us very nicely on to a couple of questions that have come in from our participants online. So the two questions that were directed at Steve and Norbert actually are about the blended learner. And the first of the questions is, Norbert, do you actually feel that the framework that you presented, U 2022, is still useful for those learning as on blended courses? And Steve, you of course talked about the fact that we might be comparing apples to oranges when we compare face-to-face with ODL, but in actual fact, do we now need to step away from that and think about the blended learner and blended learning rather than just those two?
I do think the variables that the research that I reported on identifies are important. But of course, they're not the only way in which the problem can be framed. I deliberately looked at them because that would appear to be an area where a relatively robust research evidence does exist. There's loads of others where it doesn't exist yet. I think the fundamental issues for me is that it's actually not the blended, the online, the face-to-face that's the important bit. It's the learning that's the important bit, and it's our conceptualization of what we mean by learning and how it can be fostered that's the important bit. And I think I'm much sort of less keen talking about modalities and talking about affordances than trying to get us to focus on a real in-depth understanding of what we mean by learning, so we can design properly for it. And I do think that the sorts of variables that the research I presented identifies can have a very, very meaningful contribution to make in terms of our understanding of what learning is and how to foster it.
Thanks for that. Steve, over to you.
That was a very nice answer, actually, and it sort of fits with mine. I was just going to say, really, just in terms of apples and oranges, it all depends on context and where you come from. So if I was an academic scholar looking at learning, I'd take that approach from Norbert, and I'd want to look at those nuances and granularities and that. If I come from a senior executive point of view, then yeah, I do want to compare apples and oranges, because I'll give you an example. So in Australia, we have one league table for all Australian universities, 39 of them. They're ranked from top to bottom. And those 39, probably 10% of those have the high percentage of online distance education learners. It really disadvantages at a university like the University of New England, the way that the ranking system works. So when I have to argue, or we're looking at policy, or we're arguing with government, then yes, I want to say we're comparing apples with oranges. I want to look at those differences, because we could really flip those tables around. And it certainly disadvantages us in terms of funding and other areas as well. So it depends. So my point is, it depends where you come from, I think, about how you want to phrase that question and how you want to use it as a blunt instrument or in a more granular way. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Does anybody want to add to this discussion in any way? Oscar.
Yes. Yeah. So you think so much about the idea that we need to start more than I think taking us back a little bit to also ask the questions. When we have this debate about which one is better, who are the best teachers and why do they hold those positions? Because then they will go back to those best teachers.
Yeah, I think it's really important, obviously, to look very carefully at the context within which the question is posed and for whom you're meant to be answering it. You know, if you're looking at the learner and if you're after trying to achieve the best possible transformational outcome in terms of the life chances, the contribution, the ability to contribute effectively to society, and in those sorts of terms, you're obviously going to start to measure effectiveness in rather different terms, as if you're doing that from a government perspective, and you're particularly interested in the contribution these programs can make to the skill space of the country. There isn't going to be one sort of a single answer, but at the same time, I think if we want to, defend our endeavour and argue the efficacy of its purpose, we need to be aware that there's a wide range of audiences out there who we need to address in some way or other. So a lateral perspective, in my view, would be the way forward, rather than getting too worked up about some minor specific question.
Right, Linda is giving me a sign that I need to stop this, but I have somebody who had her hand up here just because, so perhaps we'll have this is the final question, please, and then we can move on.
Really wanted to thank panelists to say the right focused on course design. But really interesting step for myself is actually how professional and pastoral services sort of support success in online distance education, and actually how high is that statistical correlation between programs which are augmented online distance students in helping them to achieve success. So really thank you over the course of the conference about those dimensions.
The dimensions around professional support for students in terms of supporting their success.
Yeah, like success coaches, how can we augment professional services and research skills in areas of our organisations to support agencies.
Coaching, study skills, academic skills.
Well, I just go back very quickly to the point I made about self-efficacy and the importance of it, and the lateral understanding of it would include the sort of dimensions that you outline. And like in any sort of context, in the same way, if we go into a primary school as a teacher and we're expecting pupils to be able to do group work effectively, we'll have to teach them how to do that in order for them to be able to. Same applies in the online context. We can't just assume our learners to be able to bring the behavioral intention, as I called it with reference to you, just by virtue in terms of a precondition, because they need to be familiarized to the way in which we design our programs and design the support infrastructure to be able to learn how to display these behaviors. So I think you're absolutely right, and we maybe need to take a more lateral perspective on the design of programs and how important these other dimensions are. So, which is why in university context, we very often speak in terms of education as opposed to teaching and learning, because we recognize that there's a wider range of dimensions, just the pedagogical ones.
Thank you. I'm going to stop us there. Thank you, Christine. Thank you hugely to the panel, to Stylianos, to Norbert, to David, and to Steve. I'm sure you will want to join me in showing your appreciation of their contributions and their provoking us to think. But more than that, you've been asked to think about and to indicate how you see this project or how you think this project should be shaped. So please, can you think about that and feedback? There's a piece of paper on the table.
The QR codes on the paper.
There are QR codes. Use those, please, because that will help us determine how the project moves forward. Because this isn't the end of the discussion. This is
The start.
a beginning. Thank you all very much, and let's show our appreciation.